Thank you so much to MCOA for having me here. I'm delighted to be with you today. I work at JF&CS in Waltham, and I'm the coordinator of the JF&CS Memory Cafe Percolator, which has been a resource for memory cafes since 2014. And I just want to remind you that our webpage is here, and there's really just a ton of free resource material there for anyone interested in memory cafes or even related creative arts programming for older adults or people living with dementia. You can certainly tap into a lot of these materials and get some guidance. So we have a free memory cafe toolkit in English and Spanish, and the supplement, which focuses on virtual and hybrid model cafes, is going to be posted very soon. We have public service announcement videos, and I'm going to show you our new one in a little bit. Recorded webinars on memory cafes for various communities and a lot of different aspects of running memory cafes. And we have the archives from our quarterly idea exchanges, where we often have memory cafes do presentations about what they do and talk about operational challenges that cafes face. At that webpage, you can join the Percolator mailing list and Google group and have access to all of our resources on an ongoing basis. So we're a small group, so we won't bother with the poll, but I know people are coming to this with a lot of different interests. You may be running a memory cafe, thinking about going virtual. You may be thinking about starting a cafe. You may be running other types of creative arts and social engagement programming. So we're glad to have you. This presentation is going to briefly just do the little overview of what makes a memory cafe, and then show you a snapshot of how cafes are adapting to the pandemic. And then we'll focus in on tips on leading virtual or hybrid cafes. And what I mean by hybrid is just some kind of blend of in-person, virtual, and other approaches to connecting with your participants. And then where to find more resources, and then we'll open it up for discussion. What is a cafe? So there are certain ingredients that are unique or specific to memory cafes. I won't say unique. So the focus is on social connection as opposed to sharing information about dementia. They are for people living with dementia and their care partners, and that can include family members and friends and professional caregivers if they have one. They are for people with dementia due to any medical cause at any stage of disease progression. No one is asked their diagnosis. That's very important because a lot of people attend who have not been diagnosed or have been diagnosed, but they really don't want to hear those disease labels, or they're not aware of the disease label. And then finally, they're tailored to local interests, language, and needs. So every cafe should look different. I sort of think of them as the local coffee shop before Starbucks came in and created a kind of more homogenous model. The cafes really should have the flavor of the community that they serve. So before March, last March, I should say, there were 120 memory cafes in Massachusetts, which made us the number 2 state for memory cafes, right on the heels of Wisconsin, which had about 130. So we were just right behind them. And all were in person. And so since then, of course, there have been enormous changes. About 24 have had to close because staff and resources had to be reallocated. About 30 are taking place virtually at this point, and many, many others have met outdoors during the warmer months and are staying connected in other ways or are still in a state of transition. What is clear is that as we look towards more people being vaccinated and warmer months and hopefully a point where we can meet more safely in person again, we aren't going back to the old way. We're really moving forward into something new. And so the Percolator did a survey in February last month, and of the 51 respondents, the great majority said that during 2021, they are looking towards some kind of hybrid model, a mixture of in-person and remote cafe activities. about a dozen people said that they're planning to stay with remote only. And interestingly, only 4 are looking to go back to in-person during 2021, even though that was the way we used to all deliver all of our cafe gatherings. So what does hybrid mean? So of the 37 respondents who are planning on hybrid during calendar 2021, most are thinking what that will mean for them is that the majority of their cafe gatherings will be remote with occasional in-person gatherings. And then the second largest number, about 8 people, are planning on simultaneous with some people gathering in person while others are connected by teleconference. And I'm going to talk about that issue later in the training. So I think it's really interesting that the virtual model is we've gotten over a hump, and it's clearly an important modality to us that's not just going away. And I think part of what we've proven to ourselves is that meaningful social connection can happen at virtual cafes. And I always like to show this image from dementiamentors.org. You see their URL there if you'd like to take a look. That's an organization that has been running virtual international memory cafes for over 6 years. And what's more, these cafes are just for people living with dementia. So care partners do not participate. And so they've really demonstrated that people living with dementia can absolutely acclimate to Zoom and really form a sense of connection, because these are people who've never met in person. So if you're interested, you can go to their website, and they have a short little video to show you what their virtual cafe looks like. But the picture is more complicated than that, because what we've found is virtual is better for some and it's not good for others. So virtual is better for people who have a significant physical disability. For example, we're seeing guests who are on hospice care attending cafes, people who have limited transportation. Virtual cafes also have this wonderful benefit of being able to convene people from many places together. So, for example, at my monthly cafe, I often will have a woman who's living with dementia and her 2 adult daughters who live in other states, sometimes with their young children, and also her best friend who lives in another town, and they will all meet together at our cafe. The virtual cafes are also increasing language and cultural accessibility, because there are not many memory cafes held in languages other than English or specifically designed for particular cultural communities. But because there are now some that are virtual, people can attend them from anywhere. So I know there are Brazilian immigrants in Greater Boston, for example, who attend Memory Cafe Brazil, which is located in Sao Paulo. Virtual is not good for everybody. It is not accessible for those who don't have access to the technology. And that can mean the actual equipment or bandwidth, and also it can mean lack of comfort using the equipment. Virtual is also not workable for some people with advanced dementia. And I really want to emphasize it's some, but not all. It's very individual. It's not necessarily about the stage of disease progression. There are many people with advanced dementia who enjoy a virtual format, and it can even work better for them. There's a person who attends my cafe who, really likes to vocalize and move around, and he can do that very easily during the cafe. He's on mute. He'll often have a musical instrument with him, and it actually works out beautifully for him. But some people with advanced dementia just find sitting in front of a screen to be confusing or disengaging. And so those folks have dropped out of the virtual modality. So now I just want to go through a bunch of specific tips about running a virtual cafe. And before I do, I just want to say, sometimes people ask, could I start a cafe from scratch as well as converting one from an in-person format? And yes, there are a number of new cafes around the country that are starting as virtual programs from scratch. So there are some basic questions you want to start with. How local do you want to be? So this is a question we never really had to ask when our programming was in person, because people would only attend if they were within transportation access. But now you have to kind of make a decision. Do you want to throw open the gates and let people attend from anywhere, or do you really want it to have a geographic focus? And part of that is thinking about, do you plan to have in-person gatherings at some point? And if so, if you have people who join and become part of your community from far away, they're never going to be able to come to your in-person gatherings. So you just want to kind of think about that. There's no right or wrong answer, but you do want to be aware of that issue and let people know what the plan is if they join. I will say, I really wondered when all this began whether sort of the concept of local would just disappear, and it really hasn't. I do find that most people who join cafes are still choosing ones that they have some kind of connection to, whether it's geographic, and that could be where they live, or maybe where their adult children live, for example, or they have some kind of affinity for the organization that runs the program. So people, some people are getting participants from far-flung areas, but it's not a huge phenomenon. There's still a sense of local. Second, you have to sort of think about, who are you hoping will participate, and do they have access to technology and comfort using it? And then, are you and your team members comfortable using a particular platform? Does your facilitator have adequate bandwidth? For those who are working from home, this is a big issue if you're running an interactive program. Might you need additional equipment, an external microphone for better sound quality, or a camera? So these are just preliminary questions to consider. And then there are a lot of details. So I'm going to run through cost, length or frequency of the event, information about technology, how you set up your room, roles and responsibilities, which includes volunteers, registration process, protocol and confidentiality, activities, facilitation techniques, and outreach. And I'm going to touch on all these just at the very, very top level. And then if you want to delve into any of these topics, you can let me know by just unmuting yourself and asking a question, or putting a comment in the chat. And then the toolkit supplement goes into much greater detail on all of these topics. I'm just going to pause here and see if anyone has questions or comments so far. Okay, we'll keep going then. So costs. So generally speaking, virtual cafes are a little bit less expensive to run than in person. Cafes are not super expensive to begin with. The cost, usually I estimate between $12,000 and $14,000 a year. Really, the bulk of that is the salary or the time of the coordinator. So if it's part of that person's role and there's no separate payment for that person, you could just consider it's incorporated in your budget. It takes, maybe 5 hours a month to run a once a month program. But, for a lot of cafes, one of the higher expenses was food. And obviously, if you're doing a virtual cafe, you don't have to pay for food or paper goods, supplies. You are having to pay for your platform. Frequency and length, prior to the pandemic, most cafes were meeting once a month for an hour and a half to 2 hours. And there is a trend for virtual cafes to be shorter and more frequent. So an hour to an hour and a half, 2 to 4 times per month. But you can just pick what works for you. I have continued to run my cafe once a month for 2 hours. I do find it's helpful to break up that 2-hour time block in some way. So at my cafe, we spend the last half hour on a discussion about a conversation prompt, and that's been a nice way for those who want to leave at that point. And then it's usually a bit of a smaller group, more intimate, and it's a nice, really kind of quiet way for people to spend that last half hour after they've kind of warmed up on an activity. You always want to make sure people are moving around and not just kind of sitting in front of Zoom for that long. But most cafes already are doing something with music or movement, so that's usually baked in there. So, technology, there are really two aspects to accessibility. And the first is accessibility for you. So, I think for lots of us, this pandemic has really forced us to build a completely new set of skills that we never wanted to, we never really particularly wanted to build. And it's been a real challenge. Um, and I think it's very important when you're running a program like a memory cafe that's primarily geared toward establishing a sense of community and having people feel less isolated, that you create a comfortable kind of vibe. And you can't really do that if you're extremely uncomfortable with the technology. So I really recommend running practice meetings with friends or colleagues. Log in early with co-facilitators to test and set up everything. Just, anything you can so that you feel more at home. And then there's tech accessibility for your guests. So every community is different. And if there's a way you can sort of take the tech temperature of your community, that's great. And I know the COAs have been hard at work for months doing just that in a variety of ways to find out what technology folks have, what they feel comfortable using. But it really varies. In some of my programming, I work a lot with immigrant communities, and it's been really interesting to see that some communities people use WhatsApp, at others they use Skype to sort of communicate with family back in the home country. So that people are very comfortable with certain platforms and not others. So whatever the case may be, you want to know that there's tremendous variability in terms of broadband access based on many, many factors. It really is an equity issue. Not everybody has broadband, not everybody has devices. And then if they do, they may need quite a bit of coaching and assistance. And you can do that lots of ways. You can open up your cafe gathering earlier for people to join and get settled. You can designate someone during your cafe to be the tech person to help somebody who's struggling. You can have one-on-one assistance available at other times. My cafe partners with Brandeis University, and a cadre of students became tech volunteers. So they've been available at other times to do a phone call and coach people through whatever they're having a hard time with. I do think it's very helpful to review the basic controls for your platform at the start of every cafe. Can you offer a telephone only option? So, with all of this increased reliance on teleconference, I think we've also come back to the importance of sort of the old technology, such as telephone and mail. And I know councils on aging have been doing an amazing job keeping in touch with your folks by telephone and mail, and cable TV, sort of the older technologies. But it is a nice thing that a teleconference will also provide a call-in option, and you just have to think through systems for that. So how will people RSVP? How will they receive the call-in number? If you're going to be showing slides, can you mail those in advance to them? But it can really add a lot of accessibility if you provide that option. One nice thing about teleconferences is they're more accessible for deaf and hard of hearing people because they can call in through a caption call phone, and some platforms have automated captions, or you could set up a way to add captioning. So setting up your room, so it's really important to join your meeting a little bit ahead of time so you can set up your lighting. I'm looking at my thumbnail video here and noticing today's a bright and sunny day, and I'm getting sort of strange light from the window over here. So, that's an example of something where I should have maybe fine-tuned that. But that's a consideration. Background, this picture here is something I think a lot of us have seen, with the bizarre floating head of somebody using a virtual background without a green screen. You can buy a pop-up green screen if you love your virtual background and you don't want to have to put the laundry away behind you in your room. Bandwidth, yours and any co-presenters. This is something that I've dealt with, a lot of Memory Cafe coordinators have dealt with, is that sometimes the guest presenters, for example, musicians, if they are new to this way of presenting, they may not really have good audio or a stable internet connection. And so sometimes I've found it's important to do a Zoom meeting with them in advance to just check all that out and troubleshoot. Audio quality can be adjusted through equipment, but also settings. Something like Zoom is optimized for talking, not for music, but there are settings that make it work for music. So roles and responsibilities. I think this is something where it was more obvious to us when we were in person that we wouldn't have the same person carrying a tray of drinks and a tray of donuts and carrying the registration forms all at once. But in this new virtual world, it's the same issue. There are a lot of different tasks to do. Running and managing the teleconference, providing assistance to guests, monitoring the chat, kind of facilitating. And if you can dice those up and have more than one person, that's great. It can be a good role for volunteers. Even if you don't have a second person, this is something that I've been doing, is calling into the meeting on my phone and just opening up the chat box on my phone so that I can easily see what's going on in chat. So sometimes, even if you just have a second device, that can be helpful. Volunteers have always been an important part of cafes because they offer a double benefit. They help you, and then they gain a new perspective on living with dementia from seeing people in a very joyful, strength-based environment. So you may want to give them some of these virtual management tasks. And then short of that, they may not realize how big a benefit they create just by participating enthusiastically on the screen. Their smiles, their energy help to create the environment. And you need to be explicit. I mentioned that I have a partnership with Brandeis, and I had to recently talk with the volunteer coordinator there and just say, the students need to keep their camera on, because I think some of the students are used to attending classes or meetings with their camera off, and they're multitaskers. That's just what they do. And I had to be very explicit that volunteering virtually means your camera on, unless there's some reason why you have to turn it off, and just really showing your enthusiasm, and that makes a big difference to the atmosphere. Before I dive into registration, any questions or comments so far? Okay, I know I'm chugging through a lot of information, and feel free to chat or just unmute yourself and jump in at any point. So registration, this is one of the kind of more complicated aspects for cafes or similar programs, is how do you balance security, accessibility, and your own informational needs? And you do need some information. What if you're going to have to change or cancel your meeting? How will you reach people? Do you need to gather contact info or to take attendance for your own systems? So I've broken it down into kind of a range of options. The most accessible is also the least secure. It gives you the least info, which is just put your teleconference link out there, share it widely, don't require RSVPs, share it through social media, and whoever shows. We're not hearing as much about Zoom bombing as we did months ago, but it is still the case that if you share your link that way, especially through social media, anybody could show up, and you don't have any idea who's coming, and you have to come up with a way of taking attendance or getting information from people who may attend. So middle of the road is require anyone who's coming for the first time to RSVP directly to you, so to your email, your phone, and then you can send them the meeting link. And if you have a mailing list of your ongoing participants, you can go ahead and share that meeting link with them. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the least accessible, but the most secure, And the most information for you is to require advanced registration through the platform. So, for example, through Zoom for everybody. And then people each get an individual link to the meeting. So it's highly secure. You don't have people crashing your meeting. And you have a running list of who's registered and their email address. But it means each person has an individual link. So you don't have a way of kind of sending out a blitz and reminding people of the meeting link. So if you do that, make sure to resend the individual links prior to your cafe, and you can go into the meeting platform and do that. But it's still difficult. I myself opt for the middle of the road with the JF&CS Memory Cafe, and I've found that works really well. Protocol and confidentiality. So this is another way that virtual gatherings are just different, is that there's different protocol. So it's important to establish that at the beginning of gatherings. It's good to let people know that you'd like them to mute unless they are speaking, to encourage them to have their camera on if they're comfortable. You may want to ask your guests not to take screenshots because people need to have the right to give permission to have their picture taken. And that is one tricky thing, is people can take screenshots without anybody knowing. Explain, however, that you cannot assure confidentiality because your guests are participating from their own residence. You might do that more in a mailed disclaimer, or you might do it during the cafe gathering. Screen names, if people are calling in, if you're able to, you may want to change their phone numbers to names. And if people are sensitive about attending, you could consider changing the names to first names only. So that would be a good role for a volunteer to go through and do that at the beginning of the meeting. That is not only about confidentiality, but it also is a way to encourage interaction. I know of a cafe where what they do at the beginning, and there's a designated person who does this, who goes through and just changes everybody's screen name to just their first name in capital letters with a space between each letter, so that you have sort of a visible name tag. And they do that as a way to encourage interaction. If you're going to record, of course, you need to notify your guests, just as Patty did at the beginning here. Use the speaker view setting. If you don't want to have as many guests popping up in your recording, but know that if someone speaks or even unmutes and makes noise, they're probably going to show up in that video. So you have to really preview it and get permission from anyone who might appear in it if you're going to post it. But posting the recordings can be really worth it. And this is a quote from someone who, about a different memory cafe, who said, "My wife watched the video 29 times in just a couple of days." So if you're able to, it can be quite nice to record at least part of your cafe. So one question people have had a lot is, what do you do at a virtual cafe? And really, you can do most of the same things you do in person. If you're having a musical performer, you have to change, or that person needs to change some of their settings, and ideally needs a good quality microphone. It's really frustrating if the sound quality is poor. So that is important. Sing-alongs or group music making requires muting everyone because people's audio is traveling through their own bandwidth, so everybody's going to be out of sync. I think we've all gotten used to this phenomenon. But sometimes it's fun to unmute people for a brief time just to hear each other, but it will be, loud and chaotic. Dance and movement may require that your presenter has an extra camera so their whole body is visible. And here you see Jill Braverman, who's a yoga instructor. She has her studio set up that way so that people can more easily follow along because they can see all of her. And so she also has her audio set up to allow that because she's far back from her camera. One thing to be wary of is showing long videos over teleconference. That's something that I saw a number of memory cafes kind of playing with early on, was, well, maybe we could watch a movie together and then discuss it. But videos require so much bandwidth, and so it's quite likely for some of your participants that the visual will freeze during it, and that's really frustrating. So it isn't good to rely on being able to show long videos as kind of the meat and potatoes of what you do. What you can do that's special is take advantage of everyone being in their home. So you can have people do sort of show and tell more easily. Bring something from home that makes you smile. Or if you're doing music, get something from the kitchen to make rhythm with, a cheese grater and a chopstick. Or collect some paper, we're going to make collages together. You can also do things like encouraging moments of reflection where everyone listens to the ambient sounds and then shares what they're hearing. It's going to be different for each person, or notice sights around us. And there's a certain intimacy to kind of being in each other's homes that way. And so do take advantage of that. I just want to mention the June 2020 Percolator meeting. We had a panel of teaching artists in all different modalities talking about what they do, how they do it virtually, their tips. So that is one of the archived recordings there that might be helpful to some. So how do you facilitate differently through teleconference? Basically, be big, be bold, and engage guests by name. So anything you can do to kind of reach in and help people feel connected is very good. And otherwise, it's pretty much the same. Outreach. So outreach has always been one of the bigger tasks for memory cafes. It's been challenging because people don't talk about dementia very much. And also, most of the public is not familiar with the cafe model. So it's not something that they would think to go out looking for in most cases. But now we have an additional challenge, which is there is a widespread assumption that people living with dementia really can't do virtual, that they wouldn't be able to enjoy it. And so what we in the cafe world have found is that not only do we need to just advertise our program to let people know when and where and how to join, but we need to actually go farther and show a little bit of how cafes work. And so I always recommend hold an educational event about dementia where you're targeting a broader group of people than who you would expect to come to your cafe. And so, for example, if you can have someone from the Alzheimer's Association speak, or the Dementia Friends program, you can do one of the 1-hour information sessions, or just something, some kind of broader topic related to dementia. And as part of that, introduce your cafe and show a little bit of what it's about, and ask the people who come to be your ambassadors. Let them know, it's hard for people to find out about these programs. So many people living with dementia and their care partners have become isolated due to the challenges of dementia and the lack of public understanding about dementia. So think of someone you may know who could benefit, and can you invite that person? Could you bring that person the first time? Could you come with them? And that way you've gotten the word out to a broader audience, which then may be able to connect you with potential guests. So the Memory Cafe Toolkit has a lot of guidance about outreach, as does the supplement that'll be posted soon. And the Percolator also created a public service announcement video, and I'm going to be showing it to you soon because we redid it for the virtual world. So other ways that cafes are connecting with guests, there are many, many, many. And these absolutely overlap with what COAs are doing in their other kinds of programming as well. And I just want to acknowledge in the chat, Patty chatted that MCOA has been offering dementia training for transportation providers of all stripes to get the word out about dementia and memory cafes. So it's great. So again, the telephone has kind of reemerged as a very vital and irreplaceable lifeline to folks. And there are cafes that have been pairing their guests as well, so that they call each other on a regular basis. There have been a lot of cafes that create some kind of craft kit, either for drop off or pickup, that people can do on their own, or sometimes they do part of it on their own and then they meet on teleconference to do part of it. There's been a lot of making handmade cards and sending those to guests. Recipe swap is something that one cafe has been doing, a lot of making use of other kinds of digital resources, such as Time Slips is a phenomenal free resource which has conversation prompts called Beautiful Questions. It has a storytelling resource. It has little mini projects. All of this you can access for free. So that can be made use of. And, there's all kinds of nature videos, webcams, recorded concerts, etc. So a lot of cafe coordinators have been sharing these kinds of resources with their guests as well. And outdoor cafes have emerged as an important option as well. And of course, they don't work in all weather, but we're coming back into a warmer time. The picture on the left there, you see the Rest Stop Ranch in Topsfield. They've always had a seasonal outdoor cafe. It's a beautiful place if you ever have a chance to go there. They do outdoor cafes from March or April through October, and so they really this is their bread and butter, how to do this outdoors. But other cafes have had to figure it out, and of course weather is an issue. It has been quite time consuming for many COAs and other providers to get permission to use a public space. Maybe that will be changing as we continue this process of adapting to the COVID world, but it's important to allow yourself enough time for that. You can have families or bubbles sit together. Things like choosing a solo musician rather than a musical group, because that's pandemic safer. Avoid activities that would require converging on a supply table. Food, of course, creates challenges because then people take off masks. So people can bring their own food or order from a restaurant, which requires firm RSVPs and funds. Ensure extra distance if there will be eating. But on the flip side, being outdoors is absolutely wonderful. It's very healing. It's very inspiring. And you can make use of nature. You can do art activities that involve finding objects around you, depending where you're meeting. You can consider field trips. So if you're meeting outdoors, maybe meet at a special destination. So there are lots of possibilities, and I think we'll see a lot more cafes meeting outdoors. So now I just want to go through some tips about hybrid cafes, and then we'll kind of wrap up me talking to you, and I'll really want to have more of a discussion. But hybrid is just a mix of any of these components. So in-person, outings, activity kits, virtual recordings, etc. There are some really interesting combinations taking place out there. One way is to usually meet on Zoom or teleconference with occasional in-person kind of parties or outings. You could do it in the other way, usually meet in person with short Zoom kind of coffee hours in between. In either of those situations, what you're doing is making sure that all of your guests have a way to at least participate sometimes. So the people who really can't come in person, as well as the people who really can't come virtually, they all have at least some options to attend. I'd mentioned the art kits. You can sort of combine that with the teleconference element, record and share the in-person gatherings, as I had mentioned before. Dementia Friendly Fort Worth runs the Fifth Street Cafe in Fort Worth, and they do this cookie baking thing on Zoom where they ask their participants in advance, what kind of cookies should we make? They do the demo together on Zoom, and then the coordinator actually drops off cookies for the guests. I think that sounds luxe and amazing. I personally wouldn't be able to do that because my guests are really located in lots of places geographically, but I think it's really cool. I just was in touch with another cafe coordinator, different part of the country, who's doing a paper quilt where she's making cut paper available, but also giving people instructions to find what they need at home. And then people gather on Zoom and do this quilting reminiscence and make their quilt squares and then send them in, and then she's going to put them all together. So there's just really no end to the possibilities. So what about the simulcast? And that's the term I'm using to describe the situation where you have some people in person and some people on teleconference at the same time. So I just want you to look at this picture for a minute. This is a Harvard classroom outfitted for this kind of hybrid instruction. And so what we notice here is we see a lot of different screens so that the professor and the other students can see each other. And you can't see this, but the audio is really fine-tuned in this room. The acoustics, the microphones, so that any person in this room can speak and be heard clearly by everybody in the room and everybody at home on teleconference. And likewise, everybody at home can be heard clearly by the people in the room. So I'm going to suggest that most memory cafes do not have access to this technology, nor do we know how to use it. To get to this classroom took many, many, many months and lots of money before they figured out how to make this work. So simulcasts are really hard to pull off. It's complex to facilitate this way. And from talking to lots of people about this, the message I am getting clearly is you need at least 2 facilitators, one whose focus is on the people at home and one whose focus is on the people in the room. It's very hard to fully serve both audiences. It could be confusing or distracting, particularly for people living with dementia. There are confidentiality issues in that the people in the room are going to feel like they're in this protected space, but actually the people at home may be sitting who knows where. People could be coming and going behind them. And then again, the technology is a big piece. So at a minimum, you need a large screen so you can really see the remote participants, and the people who are in the room can see the remote participants. And you need really good audio so that anybody who speaks is on a mic, speaking through a microphone. So even educators with advanced technology and tech-savvy students are struggling with this model. And so I'm going to suggest that for a program like a Memory Cafe that has as its main objective social connection and a sense of community and reducing social isolation, this is probably not the model that's going to work for most of us. That may change as time goes by. Everything is fluid. The public is continuously adapting to teleconference modality. At some point, we won't think twice about it. There will be more tech advances. At some point, this may be a really good modality, but right now I would say proceed with caution. So now I wanted to take 1 minute and show you the new public service announcement video, which it's available now in English, and we will be adding a Spanish and a Portuguese version soon. These are available on the State Directory webpage and also on the Percolator webpage, and they're available for the use of any memory cafe. So again, because we need to not only let people know when and where our programs are, but really what a cafe is and what they look like, that's the purpose of this video. And so cafes can send these to prospective guests, prospective volunteers, to referral sources, to their local cable station or a religious congregation that shows PSAs and ask them to show it. And so we had done this some years ago, and we re-recorded it to include footage of virtual and outdoor cafes. So I'm actually going to I need to just share my audio, and we'll show you this. There we go. So this is 1 minute long.
It can be lonely living with memory loss or dementia. But you are not alone. Memory cafes are bringing people affected by dementia together at welcoming social events.
It's fun. I am so thankful to have a place where my mom and I can go and laugh and just enjoy the experience.
I've made new friends. They understand what I'm going through because they are living it too.
Memory cafes encourage me to try different activities, which is really refreshing.
You'll find guest artists, musicians and dancers, educational programs, or simply a place to relax and chat with others. These gatherings are free, and you can attend as many as you would like. Cafes are offered weekly or monthly, with options to meet in person, online, or even by telephone. Visit these websites to learn more and find a memory cafe near you.
So, whoops. That's the new video. And I want to thank MCOA for supporting the process of developing this new video. And again, we'll have it in Spanish and Portuguese in the near future. Really appreciate MCOA's support of that, and also support of the toolkit supplement, which is coming soon. So that will all be available for download at the Percolator webpage, and you can join the email list there if you're not on it. So just as a reminder, there are 2 different cafe directories that are relevant for cafes in Massachusetts. So JF&CS runs the Memory Cafe directory, and we ask that everyone please check and keep your listing current if it's not. And then nationally, there's memorycafedirectory.com, which also has a page for virtual cafes. So now I would like to pause and just open it up for discussion, questions, thoughts, brainstorming, anything that you'd like to go into in greater detail.
Wondering about with people getting vaccinated now, what does that change, if anything? I guess it's related to all of our senior centers as well.
Yeah, so I just had a Percolator idea exchange last week, and one of the questions that came in was, are you gonna require proof of vaccination to let people in person? And a lot of people had that question, and no one actually had an answer. So I think organizations are just in the midst of figuring out how that works. And yeah, it would be the same issue really for senior centers overall. Are you going to have some kind of requirement for letting people in the door? I don't know.
Yeah, okay, all right, good answer.
But it's a great question. I think it's one of so many examples where we are transitioning our very basic systems, and it's a lot of change for all of us in a very compressed time, which is really stressful, and it's hard to predict. I don't know, and again, it may be in 12 months we're going to see some new patterns for memory cafes that we can't even predict yet, because we are now really at the beginning of another transition as people get vaccinated and things start to open up more. But yet we're not 100% sure. We're worried about these variants out there. We're not kind of at the point where we're saying, okay, we're definitely on the other side of this. We hope we are, but we don't know. So, yeah, does anybody else have comments about that question?
I think, Beth, we've been talking a lot about it. We've been getting lots of questions about it. High school saying that older adults can't come in to volunteer unless they've been vaccinated. Local boards of health are ultimately going to make that decision. But it also is a shift, as Beth said, into territory we haven't been before, and who gets to make the rules and who has to enforce them. And so I think that local boards of health will be our initial guidance, and we're already working at MCOA on some reopening, or not even reopening, but it's really more the next phase that we're going into and how you need to think about things. So I think Beth has done a terrific job of outlining the issues, but nobody has the answers.
Yeah. I think the one thing I would say is memory cafes will be part of that group of programs where people will want to be the most cautious and conservative about coming back in person, because it isn't, they're
yeah, of course. So I should get off my Zoom call.
They're brief programs. So for example, day programs, which people are so reliant on, have sort of had to find ways to open up sooner. I think that, memory cafes will be sort of among the last wave to kind of go back in person. That's just my sense of it. Except for outdoor. I think outdoor, it's been happening already. Any other questions or comments or thoughts?
I just want to say something quickly. I can't say anything so long because I just figured out that my Zoom account needs to be used for an exercise class, and I didn't realize if I log into Zoom for something like this that affects that. We're setting up. We're hoping to get a memory cafe going. We have not had one in Carlisle, and we got a grant from MCOA that we're really enthusiastic about. We're going to be having a dance therapist coming, and she's going to lead dance like for people in dementia, and she's going to train us so that we can lead those kind of events too. And and we have sort of in the background this virtual idea because there's some amount of uncertainty still, unfortunately. So we're really super enthusiastic about the in-person type of thing, but thinking about the virtual for backup, and then also the reasons that you mentioned. So
Yeah.
we're still in the early phases, so I don't have the concrete questions yet.
Well, that is really exciting, Carol, and feel free as the process evolves to get in touch and take a look at the toolkit, take a look at the toolkit supplement once that's posted. And the Percolator Google group is also a great resource because people can just post a question and then hear responses from cafe people all over the country. So you've got a lot of support out there for what you're doing.
Excellent.
Look forward to seeing it go live.
Sorry,
All right. Thanks for being here.
Okay.
So any other thoughts, questions, comments? Okay. Well, in that case, thank you so much. Thank you again to MCOA for hosting this and for support with the public service announcement video and the toolkit, and for all the amazing COA staff who are running memory cafes and who are doing so many other things. And I think during this pandemic, it's just been clear what a vital role you play in your local communities, and the kind of work that COAs have done to help people with basic survival needs and staying connected. It's really been a lifeline for so many people. So thank you for what you do every day. And feel free to contact me at JF&CS at any point, and would be delighted to talk with you about anything Memory Cafe. So thank you.
Thank you, Beth.
Anything, Susan or Pat?